All right, family covenant for the modern age, but Hannah. Another Bible story that seems to justify family separation is the story of Hannah. Since Christians like this story, they naturally assume God was happy in the story. But this assumption is absurd, since God doesn't say anything at all. Why would we interpret his silence as happiness when throughout the entire Bible, God was angry? Before we analyze the story of Hannah, let's do a brief recap. There was a man named Elkanah who had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah didn't. Peninnah provoked Hannah because of her barrenness. One day, when they were at the house of God in Shiloh, Hannah was in deep anguish and prayed, "Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head." After some time, God remembered Hannah, and she conceived and bore a son whom she named Samuel. She said, "After the boy is weaned, I will take him and present him before the Lord, and he will live there always." She stayed true to her vow and took Samuel to live at Shiloh, which was a 30-kilometer walk from Ramah. When we read stories in the Old Testament, we tend to accept things as cultural differences rather than calling into question the character's morality. For example, Elkanah had two wives. We don't stop and think, maybe we shouldn't use this story as a guide to godly living. Elkanah also let his wives run the show. He didn't stop Peninnah from provoking Hannah, and he let Hannah take full control of the children. He viewed Samuel as Hannah's baby and let her name him and make all the decisions for him. So Elkanah made the same mistake every husband makes, failure to exercise authority. Thus, we shouldn't look to him as a godly husband and father. Hannah also made the same mistake every woman makes. She put her children above her husband. Her husband was hurt because she was so fixated on children, and she made him feel like he wasn't enough for her. "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" Hannah should have been fixated on fulfilling her primary role of being a helper and companion to her husband. Helping him by bearing children for him clearly wasn't her motive, since she gave Samuel to God without giving her husband any say in the matter. She let her biological urges take control of her life, which negatively affected her husband. Hannah also made the same mistake everyone makes when they're in anguish. She bargained with God. Making deals with God like this is exactly how the pagans interact with their gods. Hannah should have simply cried out to God for a son and then left the matter in his hands. We already established that God doesn't require child sacrifice, so we shouldn't take her action as a model to be followed. Just because God didn't comment on the situation doesn't mean we should assume he liked what she did. The Bible is full of examples where God stayed silent when people did bad things. For example, Jephthah made a stupid vow to God that he would sacrifice the first thing that came out of his house if God gave him victory in battle. God didn't comment. Saul made a stupid vow that none of his army would be able to eat anything until they had achieved victory. God didn't comment. We should know that God doesn't need our stupid vows in order to bless us. He's not a pagan God. He would have given Hannah a child without requiring her to use the child as a bargaining chip. God wants us to pour out our hearts to him and trust that he's a loving father who wants to bless us. That's why Jesus said not to make vows at all. God simply gave Hannah a son because he hears the brokenhearted. Just because Samuel became a mighty man of God doesn't mean Hannah did the right thing in giving him away. God specializes in bringing good out of our mistakes, so it's better to view this story as an example of God's compassion instead of making Hannah out to be a role model. Jesus gave us the perfect example of how to ask God for things. He poured out his heart, and then said, "Not my will, but yours be done." Hannah failed in this. Another thing to notice in this story is that Samuel viewed his home as the place where his parents were. When he grew up, he traveled around judging the people of Israel, and then he would return to his home at Ramah. Even though he had grown up in Shiloh, he clearly thought of Ramah as his home because that's where his parents were. All parents should understand that they themselves are the home for their children. Moses understood this when he said, "Lord, through all the generations, you have been our home."